and welcome back to the Lighthouse. My name is Jay, and I really am glad to welcome you back to another fantastic session here in the, not here in the Lighthouse, but up there in the Sustainability Constellation. We're in day 7 of the YSI Virtual Plenary. We're really busy with question fair sessions on our working group ships, and remember, we're all here to really explore new economic questions together. Now, the next speaker is somebody I especially look forward to, Geoff Mann. He has, without giving a full introduction, but allow me to just read out the title of his latest book, which is Climate Leviathan, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future. If that does not entail open questions that we need to discuss and resolve as the next generation, then I don't know what we're doing. And that's exactly why we're here. We're here to ask new economic questions, questions that are yet to be resolved, that are yet to be answered, that we need to answer in our generation here in this community. So you should now make your way up there to the Sustainability Constellation to join us in suggesting questions that we can put to Geoff after he's done with his input talk. And exactly how this works is explained in this video.
First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the questions fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find questions fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list.
With that, we're almost ready. All we need to do is to make a final check before we head up into the Sustainability Constellation. Let me check. Brennan, question moderator. That's a go. Check. Salome, session moderator. Check. Geoff, check. We're ready to go. Let's beam up the Sustainability Constellation. See you there.
Sustainability, you feel me? What's the limit of our industry, and is it an infinity? If you like driving and you're trying to go far, you should probably be familiar with the brakes on your car, or you'll break it apart. Yep, you'll properly wreck it, whether it's a colossal fossil hog or conscious electric. Check it. Why is economics not ecologics? The science of the earth and the living that we eke on it. Since making a living and living things are two concepts entwined, should economists all be ecologists? But that's not probable if our society's not sure if the earth is an offered gift or just an inert sprawl of dirt that we're to profit with. And that's not economics, that's philosophical shit. Or is it? Cause dig it, what quantifies value? And is it a subjective or an objective attribute? Value is arguably that which you have in you, and it must include that if it starts to be valid truth, that in the planet too. So what makes the table full? Whether the market is bear or a raging bull, whether we share just one small part, take the whole. What good is growth if it isn't sustainable? Sustainability, how big to be? Sustainability.
everybody. We are in the sustainability constellation. My name's Brennan O'Rear. I want to invite everyone to please read through the existing questions as we're going to be turning to Geoff momentarily. Please support those questions you feel are the strongest by liking them. In the graph, you'll see those questions already submitted, which Geoff will be discussing. And I would encourage and invite you as Geoff is speaking and you're reflecting to please suggest new and follow-up questions as they occur to you. And we will return to those after Geoff has finished.
Okay. Should I start?
No, let me first introduce you,
Okay.
Professor Mann. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Salome, and I'm coordinator of the Political Economy of Europe Working Group, and I also work on my PhD research in which I try to analyze the feasibility of implementing progressive industrial policies in transition countries. In my research, I covered the topic of climate change and the ecology. Therefore, it's my great pleasure to be moderating this very particular session as Professor Mann will talk about climate change and how mainstream economic concepts make it so difficult for us to comprehend it. Professor Geoff Mann is a senior fellow at the Institute of New Economic Thinking and professor and chair of the Department of Geography at the Simon Fraser University in Canada. He directs the Center for Global Political Economy and teaches political economy and economic geography. His most recent books include In the Long Run We're All Dead, Keynesianism, Political Economy and Revolution, and Climate Leviathan, a political theory of our planetary future, which, by the way, I have recently ordered and I cannot wait to read it. But I guess this is enough of me speaking. Therefore, Professor Mann, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Salome. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the introduction. So today I want to talk, today my talk is provisionally titled A Deer in the Headlights, Economics Faces Up to Climate Change. And mostly what I want to consider today is some of the challenges at a very broad level that face, that economic thinking more broadly faces when it tries to comprehend the challenges of climate change, both in understanding it, but also in helping us learn how we might respond to it. So I'll just begin. So if civilization sometimes seems at a breaking point these days, it's easy to forget that this is not the first time the world has seemed to teeter on a precipice. In fact, it's not even the first time in the lifetime of many of those walking around today. As Hannah Arendt said 50 years ago in The Shadow of Nuclear Buildup, to the question of how shall we ever be able to extricate ourselves from the obvious insanity of this position, there is no answer. So perhaps our trepidation is not so special, and every moment here's a rumor that it might be the last. And yet it does seem different this time, if for no other reason than it is perhaps the first in which not only the world, but the planet itself seems to be falling apart around us. And an apocalyptic sensibility right now is not confined to Chicken Littles or street corner preachers, but has become actually paradoxically quite normal. Take the following, for example. This is a quote. There is growing agreement between economists and scientists that the tail risks are material and the risk of catastrophic and irreversible disaster is rising, implying potentially infinite costs of unmitigated climate change, including in the extreme human extinction. So irreversible disaster, infinite costs, human extinction, and these are the words of an IMF research paper from 2019. So what are the political and economic implications of this sense of dread for the liberal capitalist societies that make up the wealthiest part of the world? What effects does it have on its current ways of organizing and making sense of the everyday lives of individuals and communities? I think the question is not how legitimate the sense of doom is or how to deal with it emotionally or psychologically. The question, rather, is what challenges the current conjuncture, which engenders, I would say, an expectation of political, economic, and ecological disintegration. What challenges that conjuncture poses to the dominant modes of making sense of how the world works? In other words, the challenges What challenges does the current conjuncture pose to how we represent and coordinate our collective and individual interests and commitments, and to how we understand and justify those processes to each other, to ourselves, and to history? And I want to suggest that rather than an effort to discover some hope in the dark, which I don't think can do anything but end up as a search for some as yet unidentified life raft, I think it's better to think about the kind of political economic conditions that might make hope seem like a reasonable thing to have. How do we organize political and economic institutions in the present in such conditions? Do we even have the tools to do so? Currently, we lean very hard on the concept of crisis. Crisis is one of a family of closely related nouns that have become indispensable to modern politics and economics. Crisis, emergency, exception, shock, each point silently to a break with an unspoken status quo characterized by a business as usual or the normal. This pairing of crisis and stability, exception and norm, emergency and non-emergency is central to our reality management system, a system that has been and remains essential to the way that economics, political economy, political theory, and the practice of government are constructed in the global north. Everything from our distributional policies to our democratic institutions to our production systems is predicated on at least some general sense of predictability, of an equilibrium or expected way of things. And we organize these fundamental social institutions as much as possible to weather storms or manage crises. But in the part of the globe that we call the West, the idea of permanent emergency is an oxymoron. And yet today, via some sort of world historical karma, after more than 2 centuries of arrogant triumphalism in the wealthy liberal capitalist part of the world, we seem to be degenerating into something that one could be forgiving for calling exactly that, a permanent emergency. These are the kind of conditions the global north has usually visited upon other peoples and parts of the world. But if spiraling political economic inequality and the rise of macho racist authoritarian nationalism did not seem challenging enough, climate change alone promises a red alert that will likely never turn off. The broad narrative of history as told by this civilization, a bumpy but generally consistent path called progress, does not seem to make much sense anymore. We are, I think, reaching the limits of liberalism's conceptual possibility frontier. The utility of crisis, I would say, is exhausted. Everyone from earth scientists to theologians is scrambling to make sense of what is going on, to give us some way of conceiving what our common sense renders almost inconceivable. One might even go so far as to say that if the history of the West has a plot, we are discovering it might very well be tragic. It sometimes seems as if our purpose now, as actors in this staging, is simply to delay the curtain call as long as possible. We are in a transition during which adaptation supplants progress as the object of human civilization. This has devastating implications for what I call a reality management system, because it limits its capacity to provide its technicians or anyone else with adequate political or economic orientation, growth, progress, consensus, reason, reasonableness, equilibrium. None of this can be depended upon at present. Even this reality management's conception of what it means for something to go wrong, the promised finitude of the moment of crisis, doesn't work anymore. And there is no agreed upon institutional backstop for our condition, nowhere for us to turn as a last resort, no analog of the central bank. The default expectation right now is that we will turn on each other. And obviously, ultimately, this is the real disaster. And regardless of what else the future might hold, it at least is entirely avoidable. And that's partly what I want to talk about today. I think that looking this prospect in the eye is the only way to undo this expectation that we will turn on each other, which will be all the more self-fulfilling as stresses on social and ecological systems accumulate. Sorry, just a little pause here. Getting my notes in order. I think there is a realistic way forward. Rather than inventing techno-utopian scenarios that will help us escape or acquiescing to the Hobbesian say-so and building bunkers, we have to look at this common sense, the idea that we'll turn on each other, in the eye and think hard about what is necessary to undo it. Consider the facts. These are the facts, and they're scary. Even if we were to emit no more greenhouse gases from this moment on, we have already locked in substantial sea level rise, volatile crop scorching summers, and virtually annual 500-year flooding in much of the world. Even if we're to emit no more greenhouse gases from this moment on, so-called climate refugees will almost certainly number in the tens, even hundreds of millions. The task ahead is to acknowledge this future and develop political and economic infrastructures in the present that make it possible to imagine confronting these challenges in solidarity and without violence. Right now, I would suggest current and future violence is often, if regretfully, understood as inevitable, and that expectation will be one of the main factors that lean toward it. Adapting our various ways of life at this moment is a particularly challenging problem because however much we might pretend otherwise, the task is not merely to develop productive and distributional institutions for radically different but otherwise reasonably stable conditions. On the contrary, the new normal has no center toward which it settles or tends. Equilibrium, one of the foundational concepts of economics, is an increasingly spurious proposition, I would suggest. Faith in the ultimate power of naturally equilibrating systemic forces suggests that policy is principally a fine-tuning mechanism for dynamics that tend towards stability, that a shock is always eventually absorbed by the system, even if it will take a long time. At present, I don't think any of this makes any sense. As adaptation supplants progress, tipping points and thresholds displace equilibria as the key indicators of our political, economic, and ecological systems. Now, many of you will be familiar with Keynes' famous warning that in the long run, we are all dead, the title of the book. But Keynes famously warned that faith in the long run equilibrium, as he said, is, quote, a misleading guide to current affairs. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task, he said, if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. Today, I think this seems like a terrible understatement. Our whole understanding of the long run is not just a misleading guide to current affairs, it's actually a misleading guide to the long run. If in the long run we are all dead, it is not just because if we are not careful, the short run might swallow us before we get there. Now the long run's jaws are open too. Today, there is no reason to expect the ocean to flatten. We are likely in for a permanent storm. If the very idea of equilibrium belittles present challenges by framing them as mere blips in the long-run trajectory of history, even its deferred promise is untenable now. Liberalism itself is on suicide watch. One of the defining features of equilibrium is its tight articulation with an historically particular way of thinking about uncertainty, especially in economic theory and analysis. Now, of course, economics does not assume all market-oriented modes of economic organization are in equilibrium, but it does assume that they tend toward it. If so, then it's possible to describe the various potential states of the world with a probability distribution. Any of those states of the world which is understood as less likely and less stable, the greater its distance from the central mass of the distribution. Consequently, it's possible to take uncertainty regarding future states of the world as accurately representable by probabilistic measures like risk, since any state of the world can be assigned a measure of likelihood over time. Such measures assure us that while the outcome of existing developments is uncertain, we can paradoxically be quite certain just how likely any particular outcome is. This allows us to operate with some confidence in our expectations about future states of the world based on the relative probability. Equilibrium thinking, then, determines our conceptual possibility frontier in at least two ways. First, it suggests that given current dynamics, all possible futures, however radically disequilibrium, can be assigned a probability in a system that tends towards stability, at least in the long run. This is the logic behind the idea that Keynesianism is disequilibrium economics. Second, it cannot anticipate or even conceive of what we might call catastrophic outcomes, which involve the disintegration or suspension of the system itself. There is no point inside the probability distribution indicating the likelihood that the world itself will become unmoored from that distribution. No point within the distribution that can represent an outcome beyond it. This problem has, unsurprisingly, become increasingly problematic in economics' attempts to contribute to our understanding and to our efforts to address climate change. In the realm of climate economics, it is no exaggeration to say that the limits of what I am calling equilibrium thinking have meant that until recently it has essentially operated as a placebo factory. The field's standard equilibrium and optimality analyses have functioned as sandbags around modeling islands of increasing elaborate sophistication, almost completely delinked from both the world's climate challenges and the scale of action required to deal with them. The vast majority of integrated assessment models, or IAMs, which is the workhorse tool of climate economics, as many as you will know, and the basis of virtually all carbon abatement, pricing, and taxation policy, confine economic analysis to a narrow range of futures in which very little changes but the temperature. Without radical changes to global economic regime that they accept as immutable, many of the model's priors, consistent positive long-term rates of growth, international economic development convergence, superhero backstop technologies, all of these are barely credible or even laughable. Outside the logical world of the IAM, these futures appear less and less likely as the days pass. Now, part of the problem, I would say, is the disproportionate influence of William Nordhaus and his IAM have exerted on subsequent modeling efforts. The Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy model, DICE, and the later Regional Integrated Climate Economy models, which many of you will be familiar with, which Nordhaus and his team have been developing since the early 90s, have become industry standard. Most other IAMs, even those designed to compete with RICE and DICE, have adopted their general specifications and calibration. Virtually every conversation about climate economy modeling begins with DICE, and any choice that deviates from its norm must be justified. For example, if you look at the Stern report in 2006, which uses an IAM called PAGE, or Policy House Effect, it actually spends substantial energy defending its non-Nordhaus choices. And so this makes DICE's first mover advantage substantial, and this has a devastating effect. Now, we know that Nordhaus's models, for reasons technical and political, almost certainly massively underestimate the scope and scale of the economic impacts of climate change, in part because their conception of the future is basically just a gradually warming version of today. But these models are built on the unquestioned assumption that the liberal capitalist political economic regime was and will remain stable no matter what, so that climate change represents nothing more than a shift in the cost structure with a changing temperature regime. The future described is nothing more than capitalism plus perhaps flood insurance, seawalls, and research and development in drought-resistant crops. Even the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, which by itself would increase global sea levels by 6 meters, radically altering the planet's biogeography, even that is factored in as just one more determinant of the social cost of carbon for a set of future political economic institutions that will somehow operate just like they do now, no matter how high the seas or how parched the soils. Forecasts of 2% annual global consumption growth over the next decades, standard in DICE models, are not only ridiculously optimistic, they are completely unfounded. The modelers have no more idea than the rest of us of what economic activity will be like in 2050 or 2075. DICE has thus effectively functioned as the technical expression of climate policy in the age of the new denialism, an easily replicated algorithmic dither that performs confronting the problem while justifying endless deferral. No matter what the input, the future is largely left to take care of itself. Now, the most sophisticated climate models tell us of a range of potential environmental conditions, shaped by a wide array of interconnected but poorly understood threshold effects and feedback loops. And that's just for the non-human systems. Climate economy models use these outputs as inputs and model economic impacts on the basis of climate sensitivity. In other words, the degree to which growth is affected by temperature change and attendant biogeophysical shifts. Climate sensitivity parameters are determined no more objectively than growth forecasts. They are a guessing game. Anyone who tells you that they can forecast rates of growth on a planet on average 4 degrees hotter than at present using measures of climate sensitivity based on what we know now is fooling you and themselves. Again, they have no idea. The ethical problem then lies not so much in the calculation of the incalculable, which is of course a tempting way to go here, but in the false conflation of risk and uncertainty. The argument for the defense, of course, of these models is that without the quantification made possible by the riskification of uncertainty, there's no role for modeling in assessing the evolving relation between climate change and economic dynamics. I would say that this is tantamount to saying that modeling badly or irresponsibly is better than not modeling at all. And I don't think that claim merits a response. IAMs, like other economic models of complex adaptive systems, are said to be helpful tools, mechanisms that allow us to look at how processes interact, useful heuristics that pare the world down around us to its bones so we can estimate fundamental dynamics. But even if we accept this argument, it is implausible for so fundamental a social variable in the models as something like the discount rate. In other words, the rate we discount future states of the world relative to the present. Indeed, the discount rate in the IAMs so overdetermines the results in DICE that when one chooses it, one effectively imposes an arbitrary ethical temporality on the climate economy, virtually predetermining its political economic conclusions. In DICE and DICE-derived models, these conclusions not only reflect the obviously ethical parameter of the discount rate, but they also reflect no less ideological articles of faith, like the eternal persistence of capitalism's expansionary dynamic. The result is an estimated social cost of carbon per ton at present in the models that is equivalent to the cost of a moderately expensive bottle of wine, around $35 US. Even if this social cost of carbon were put to work as a carbon tax, which hardly anywhere it is not even close to high enough to incentivize behavior that would slow planetary warming, which is usually estimated to run somewhere between $200 and $400. And yet, after championing the ruinous conclusions DICE models spit out, economists like Nordhaus are outraged when accused of running interference for business as usual. But they refuse to see that the problem is substantially of their own making, and overconfident numbers are only part of it. Economics as a discipline, like biblical exegetes of old, meticulously cultivates the expert status its technical intricacies demand. Since non-economists' ignorance is taken as given, critique is almost always written off as wrong on substance, naively ideological, or ignorant of theoretical and methodological matters. So, when rather straightforwardly ethical questions like the discount rate emerge from the morass of what looks and is meant to look to outsiders like highfalutin, you'll never understand it talk, touching on issues which are hardly anyone is neutral, we should not be surprised that they attract critical attention, and these models definitely have. This critique of standard climate economics certainly has inspired some recent soul searching. There are attempts to take account of tipping points, arguments about the appropriate shape of the probability distribution. Thresholds are trying to be modeled by critical values, which, if exceeded, shut down one or more aspects of the climate system using dummy variables quite often. And insofar as these model amendments virtually always lead to substantially higher estimates of both the social cost of carbon and the future economic damages of capitalist business as usual, they have proven useful to scientists and economists aware of the fact that the current measures have proven practically meaningless as a means to address anthropogenic emissions. Nevertheless, I would say these models have done little to allow contemporary economic analysis to move beyond its conceptual possibility frontier. There are at least two reasons for this failure. First, the models, as many argue they must be, are constructed on the same risk foundations as those upon which they are intended to improve. They cannot conceive of what Frank Knight called true uncertainty. This is the kind of uncertainty upon which Keynes built his economic analysis and led him, among other things, to emphasize a critical self-reflection among economists that IAMs reject in favor of essentially unfounded long-term prognostications that, even if the parameters were identified with perfect accuracy, would only be even close to adequate if today is a useful analogy for tomorrow. But we can't bet on this. And as Keynes famously said, we simply do not know. And this is important. We simply do not know. Ignorance is not uncertainty, it's ignorance. Not imprecise or unproven knowledge, but not knowledge at all. If I meet a perfect stranger, I am not uncertain of their name. I simply don't know it. You can't represent this kind of radical uncertainty in an error term or as a stochastic shock. To do so, as I'm saying here, riskifies it by definition, since the shock or error must be conserved as altering the quantitative, not qualitative dimensions of the dynamics being modeled. If the climate-induced shock to the Mauritius economy is the island's complete and total inundation, for example, then the entire system being modeled disappears. All climate economy modeling is unwittingly subject to total irrelevance in a very quick period of time. The second thing I want to point out here is that perhaps even more important politically, climate economic conception of uncertainty is ultimately an attempt, I would say, in the face of existential anxiety, to reaffirm the terms of liberal capitalism's reality management system. This is one of the reasons the economics literature is filled with an almost obsessive insistence on the possibility that the climate change origins of the ecological havoc around us, fire, flood, drought, extinction, is as yet somehow unconfirmed. Even economists who clearly recognize the dire straits we are in still write things in their articles like this. These are quotes. The climate system may be changing, or some climate research points to significant change, or it is possible that major natural systems will fail. Might, some, possible, could. This is hornswoggle. Every competent and honest climate scientist on the planet, not to mention the hundreds of millions of people dealing with the material effects, assures us that the planet is heating up fast, that it will be bad, and that in many places it already is. Now, of course, there are economists like Martin Weitzman, Carolyn Fisher, Valentina Bossetti, many others who reject this conditionality outright. But much of the climate economics literature reproduces unthinkingly the narrative trope that it's probably happening, but we're not quite sure. Perhaps enthralled to some idealistic commitment to scientific proof that would only be possible after the cataclysm, or perhaps not even then. I think this narrative is merely the economist's version of a much wider sensibility with regard to climate change. It is a performative doubt, a hopeful desire for uncertainty when science and the news and everyday experience suggest that the bad news is true and has been for a while. Many people, even in the privileged conditions of the global north, it seems to me, are in fact quite certain that climate change is precipitating changes to the Earth system that will be catastrophic. The uncertainty at present, then, takes two main forms. The first is a desperate hope that we are wrong about the current trajectory. And the second, since we know we are almost certainly not wrong, is a lack of knowledge about when we will no longer be able to pretend the first kind of uncertainty is real. This is, of course, if things don't change radically, and they can. But perhaps paradoxically, part of what makes it necessary to enable that transformation is a rethinking of uncertainty. It is crucial to reground the concept in its true, we simply do not know sense. We do know for certain that the climate is changing more quickly than we ever expected, and the effects are and will continue to be almost uniformly bad for life on Earth, ranging from inconvenient to catastrophic. So it is not going to be fine, and it is already not fine in much of the world. The expectation, however, that this means the end of civilization and the violence it will entail are inevitable. This expectation relies to a significant extent on the certainty that these ecological shifts can only lead to apocalypse, on an erroneous certainty. This is simply false. It is false partly because we actually have no idea what we are talking about when we say that. It's not like we have a whole catalog of historic apocalypses which point to a single logical conclusion. It is also not true because even if we did have historical proof that planetary transformation has produced apocalyptic outcomes in the past, there's no reason to be certain the pattern will repeat itself. The past is a helpful collection of lessons, but it is neither a map nor a set of social operating instructions for the future. History is interesting largely because most futures past did not turn out to be repetitions of their histories, but contain surprises, sometimes very big surprises. Which is to say, finally, the doomsayers hoarding canned goods and techno-optimists expecting some innovation that saves us all are both wrong, or at least no more right than anyone else. There is little clarity to the future, and there is hope in that. And there is no necessary truth to expectations formulated today, especially long-term expectations. It is true that if we expect violence and the end of civilization, we are much more likely to get it. But that also means that if we expect solidarity and generous, flexible, collective political economies, we are very much more likely to get them. And that is our task, to shift expectations, to refuse despondency, to do creative, honest, and what I would describe as very realistic work, formulating the foundations for political economic institutions that can handle the obvious uncertainties ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Mann, for this extremely interesting input and speech and critical perspective on this very pressing issue. Thank you. All right, now we move to the questions part. And I'll be asking you questions. And let me just remind you once again that you are to reflect upon the questions and talk about the relevance rather than directly answering them. I know it's a bit tricky, but so the first question is, are there historical examples of successful governance of global public goods? Could they inform us in our current challenges?
Okay, so I'm not supposed to try to answer it, which is actually easier in this instance because that's a very difficult but a very important question. I think this way of approaching things it's a very helpful starting point to think about the governance of global public goods. And of course, it is true that climate change, at least conceptually, is to some extent, as they say, a collective problem at the global level, or a problem of the global commons. I think the one thing that must be, in my opinion, must be kept in mind when framing about problems like climate change or other significant challenges as a global commons or a global public good is a couple of things I think need to be kept in mind when one approaches this way. Firstly, there is built into that conception, I would argue, without meaning to sound pompous about this at all, I apologize, but there is a built-in imperial view that comes with framing problems as global. They become essentially, and by default, it's not, I think it's sort of ideological, it's built into how we think. They become the purview of the powers that be, or the dominant powers. Global problems become the task or the responsibility of those who understand themselves as in charge of the world. And right now, that's very obviously what we call the global north or the West, and particular actors in that group especially. So when we frame a problem as global, which is of course crucial because it is a shared challenge, we also need to always emphasize both the specificity of experiences of that problem. In other words, for example, with climate change, there are parts of the world right now that are effectively already devastated by climate change. But that is not the case here in Vancouver, where I live. And partly that's a function of the good luck of ecology, and partly that's a function of our wealth. And so the disparateness of the experience of this public good problem needs to be emphasized right at the heart of it. It can't stay at this macro level. And the other thing I would argue is that the other problem with framing things as global is it kind of sidesteps the question of responsibility and suggests that as a global problem, we are globally responsible to address it, when in fact we know that climate change is the product of the emissions generated by very specific parts of the world and very specific populations in those parts of the world. And so to frame the global public good problem as global sometimes can allow us to duck the question of who's responsible for dealing with this, who has benefited from the unfolding devastation. And so I guess I would say that that question is an excellent place to begin. And we can look to the institutions that have addressed global problems in the past, like, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions, or even something like the Kyoto Protocol, or the up and down negotiations around whaling. We can think about these sort of global ecological problems. But in all instances, we should keep in mind a critical reflection on the way those institutions represented existing distributions of power and wealth in the world. And that has to be central, I think, to the positing of anything as global.
Thank you. I'm especially happy that you mentioned this specific approach, because I also talk about imperial mode of living in my research, and I was just happy to hear that you have same approach. All right, the second question goes: which are the main aspects of an unequal society that amplify the risks of climate change, considering both mitigation and adaptation?
Wow. Another question that I'm glad I don't have to answer. Which are the main aspects of an unequal society that amplify the risk of climate change? Again, I think this is obviously a crucial question. And if it were a research question, it would be a very important place, again, to begin, I think. But part of the problem with a framing that begins from a very general level, which is of course how almost all of us begin at some point, and I'm thinking through our research questions, is the tendency to stay at that level of generality when beginning the analysis. And I guess I would say that in the formulation of any research question, especially on something so volatile but also dynamic as the efforts to confront climate change at present, it's really crucial right at the beginning to build in specificity to the question, so that we can be aware immediately in the question. We can be told by the question in some senses that we know about the unevenness of the experience through which these problems unfold. And so, for example, if we look at the dimensions of inequality, clearly one of the first things we would want to raise is relative poverty. I mean, it's just very straightforward that, of course, I'm just stating the obvious to say that the poorest people on the planet are also almost always those most at risk of the changes brought upon by climate change. But of course, presumably, I think it's fair. I hope it's fair to assume that since we know this already, the question has to get us beyond that kind of obvious fact to the ways that those inequalities play out, for example, or the relative role of climate change in exacerbating those inequalities, or the other way, or the relative role of those inequalities in exacerbating climate change. that relationship isn't at all clear, of course, in any particular instance. And where we can derive some clarity will only be by looking in close at the particulars of history and geography and the lives that the people involved are living. So again, I would say this question is an excellent place to begin, but it has to immediately dig deeper. And I would suggest that it should do so in its very original formulation as opposed to later.
Thank you. I have third question here. How should we think about the intersection of catastrophic and existential threats with technologies whose price performance is exponential?
I'm not sure I fully understand the second part of the question, with technologies whose price performance is exponential. If there's a specific set of technologies in mind that are linked to climate change or not, I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure. Can we get a tiny bit of clarity? Is that possible?
Unfortunately, I don't have any more information about this question, but let's move on to the fourth question, and meanwhile, maybe we'll get some more clarification.
Okay. Sounds good.
So the next question is, in what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible?
Yes, this is whoever out there, the group of people that formulated this question, I am with them entirely in focusing on, at least partially, on this precisely this. Again, as a research question, of course, it's far too general. Everyone would know that. The people who formulated know that this is just to provoke conversation and to help us think. But I do believe that the task of economists, political scientists, social scientists who are confronting these issues, and not just academics, of course, but people in their lives working, dealing with these same problems. The task ahead is certainly to start to formulate ways that institutions can seem adequate to the problems ahead. And that, I think, again, requires a great deal of both theoretical creativity and innovation, which this question definitely suggests, while at the same time, a great deal of empirical specificity to the particular place. So for example, again, not trying to answer the question, it would seem to me that one of the first moves one would make in an effort to make institutions that produce the reason to make hope a reasonable thing to have, one of the first conditions of those institutions would that they be reasonably and as much as possible democratic institutions. People are much more likely to have hope if they feel like they've participated in the formulation of those institutions that are supposed to be reasonably useful to hope for. And so that move itself, of course, opens up a different kind of way of thinking about much of what we do in economics or in political science. If we think about the task of addressing climate change as the task of democratization, which are often, unfortunately, separated, then you look at a radically different kind of set of questions ahead. So formulating that question in a more specific way that points to the not necessarily obvious connections between the modes through which people organize their lives and climate change itself allows for the proliferation of questions, and it also allows for the sort of geographically and historically specificity of those questions, because if we democratize, we're saying that people in the homes and communities that they live should have a role in addressing and building the institutions that are adequate to the future. So the question is an excellent starting point, but of course, again, we need to sort of explode our head immediately upon entering into it.
Thank you. Going back to a third question, unfortunately, we're not able to clarify it from the author, but if you had to somehow modify this question, what would you change it in a question to make it more specific or more clear? Let me repeat it.
Okay.
how should we think about the intersection of catastrophic and existential threats with technologies whose price performance is exponential? So maybe you could modify the question.
Okay, I will give it a go. How should we think about the intersection? I'm reading it as I say this, of catastrophic threats with technologies, price points. I mean, again, I don't want to do an injustice to the question, which is clearly pointing towards stuff that I'm not clicking into here. But I do think that the connection between the potential for catastrophic outcomes and technology that's a crucial relationship that needs to be examined, not only in its actual, in the technological dimension, insofar as we have to look at these technologies to think about how they may or may not help us address the future. For example, there's a wonderful book and a really astounding thinker by a professor named Holly Jean Buck, who is actually trying to make a progressive case for geoengineering. Now, I'm still very much not convinced that geoengineering is the right way to go, but she is really thinking through hard a lot of questions that many of us have kind of avoided on principle, whereas she's taken the question on. But I would say that the relationship between technology and catastrophic outcomes is crucial to study, not only in its sort of empirical doability, but also insofar as there is a way of living in the world today, especially in the wealthiest parts of the world, that immediately links particular challenges like, say, climate change with a technological response. The assumption is not that that the shifts that are necessary to be adequate to this future are institutional or ideological or democratic. That's not the way we turn. We turn to technology. Technology seems to be the obvious response. And that in itself, I think, says a lot about where we're at and how democratic our responses will be. So making that link between technological changes and the sort of, how would I describe it? The menace of the future, or the perceived menace of the future, is crucial to any understanding of where we are at and where we might be able to go.
Thank you so much, Professor Mann, for that. As we are approaching the end of the session, would you like to add something, to reflect upon something more specific, some more thoughts?
I mean, not that I probably have time to do.
we still have like up to 5 minutes.
Okay.
If you would like, only if you would like.
Yeah. No, I don't have a ton to add. I am very grateful for the opportunity to participate, and thank you, Salome, for leading me through this. I really appreciate it. The only thing I'd want to do is just sort of to re-emphasize what I hope came across in my brief presentation, which is that there is a very big difference, I think, between understanding and there's a very big difference between the sensibility of doom that presides over, I think, a lot of what I hope I'm not overgeneralizing, that presides over a lot of those of us who study these problems, and the inevitability of our expectations of how we will deal with catastrophic changes or very, very significant changes. And I really would say that the most hopeful work we can do right now is to creatively posit and, if possible, build institutions in the broadest sense that make it seem like hope is a smart thing to have. So hope is a reasonable thing to have. And I think we can do that. Like it'll be hard, and it'll take a lot of work, and it'll take a lot of collaborative work, which I at least sometimes get really tired of. But it is doable. And if it's doable, then we shift people's expectations about how we will deal with these problems in a way that actually makes the problems themselves much easier to get our heads around. Climate change is not going to go away. We've already locked it in. So we have to just deal with a world that we can mitigate it as much as possible, of course, but we also are going to be living in a climate change world, and so are our children and their children. And so that work of making hope reasonable seems to me the most important work.
Well, thank you very much once again, especially for this positive ending and inspirational ending. I don't know. I make tons of notes for myself. I'll be using them in my own research for improving arguments. Obviously, I'll be citing you. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was nice to meet you.
Likewise. And with this, the first part of the session is over, but the second one is about to begin. But before that happens, we go back to the studio.
We're back in the studio. Thank you so much, Salome, for this great moderation of Geoff Mann's talk. Geoff, your final words really struck me. I can't agree enough with you. And I think we embrace that notion also in the Young Scholars Initiative. If we can get around the fact that we are in this together and we have to face these problems together, it becomes a little bit easier to understand that all the difficulties, all the tensions, all the frustrations that we have to deal with in order to achieve this collective goal become an achievable goal as long as we understand we're doing this together. So, Geoff, thank you very much for saying these words. Now let's go right into it, though. I would like to go right back into the sustainability constellation, where Brennan will help us look at the questions we've just discussed.
Thanks very much, Jay. So the questions that Geoff commented on, as perhaps listeners know from prior sessions, were those suggested that received at the time the most support, the most likes. So I'll just read through those questions. We'll be taking them and improving upon them now. Those questions were, are there historical examples of successful governance of global public goods? Could they inform us in our current challenges? Which are the main aspects of an unequal society that amplify the risks of climate change, considering both mitigation and adaptation? How should we think about the intersection of catastrophic and existential threats with technologies whose price performance is exponential? And in what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible? And now we will work collaboratively on possible alternative phrasings for each of these questions to improve them, and just reminding folks that we are improving them as research questions. So trying to lay the groundwork for those taking these up as research questions within the field. You're invited to suggest new phrasings, to change your likes from an original phrasing to another that might be better, or that might strike you as a better research question. And please do, if you see a question that you believe merits discussion, or a point that is important to be brought up regarding a rephrasing, please do raise your hand using the Zoom button. If you wish to comment on a question, you will be given the floor. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, so just looking through the questions list now, I see that we continue to have a lot of support for and likes for this question: in what ways can our current political system be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible? I would invite anyone who sees a way this might be simplified, might be clarified, might usefully be expanded, to please suggest a rephrasing for the question. This is a great time to do that. Reflecting again on in what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible. Big, broad question there. it may be that some folks have examples you'd like to add to the question. A sustainable future, obviously, being a very, very big, encompassing phrase, or perhaps it's best left as is. I'm not seeing any suggested rephrasings there. And it is our top most favorited with 5 favorites. So it looks like we definitely have a popular favorite there. Turning now to another question, this one having 4 likes, beautifully rephrased. What characteristics, I'm reading the rephrase that has 4 likes, what characteristics of the political economy of a society, e.g. inequality, complexity, amplify the risks of climate change, considering both mitigation and adaptation? Oh, and I see we also have, so we have 1 like for the original phrasing and 3 for the rephrasing there. So in the first phrasing, we're focused specifically on inequality. What aspects of inequality amplify the risks of climate change? And in the second, we have characteristics of political economy, including of a society, including inequality and complexity as examples, which amplify the risk of climate change. Looks like I saw some likes jockeying around there. We seem to have, the majority seems to have decided on what characteristics of the political economy of a society, such as inequality and complexity, amplify the risks of climate change, considering both mitigation and adaptation. Turning now to another question. This one came up towards the end with it sort of shot up the leaderboard and now has 4 likes. So it's actually the second most liked at this point. Question, are there historical examples of successful governance of global public goods? Could they inform us in our current challenges? And of course, Geoff spoke regarding this this question and a need to clarify further from the outset. To that end, if anyone wants to suggest a rephrasing, that would be wonderful. You're very much invited and encouraged to. Or if the group thinks it's really best left open, broader, that's fine. But please do suggest a rephrasing for this question now in the next minute or two if you believe it would be a better research question with a rephrasing. Again, that question, are there historical examples of successful governance of global public goods? Could they inform us in our current challenges? Looks
Hi,
like
Brennan. I'm on the call too. Can I?
Yes, please.
Hi there. So this is a super interesting question, partly because I'm also super interested in economic history. The question that poses itself is that, of course, we're dealing with a much bigger world now than we did ever before, where also the problems are really at a different scale. If we think about how we have dealt with previous global challenges and crises, I think we are looking at times where there were major power blocks. For example, the United States after World War II was, of course, a major player that could by itself without needing to cooperate with many other power blocks, transform half the world in its image, and also address some of the challenges. Not to say that that was a good thing, but the United States could sort of set the tone by having one national interest sort of aligned throughout its sphere of influence. Now that we have a multipolar world with different systems, with different interests aligned, I am not sure how we address a common goal that is clear, and also the thing that leads to this challenge being connected to another question is the political system, because I think the narrative has changed very much since the 1990s in the United States. If we look at that, for example, a common, and this links it also maybe to what Mariana Mazzucato says, mission driven has been in the Cold War. There's sort of a common, because we had the systems, we had to sort of go beyond a narrow interest.
Thank you, Jay, for that context. Absolutely critical considerations and underlining why this is such an important question, not only for economics as a field, but for our entire species. It looks like we do have some suggested rephrasings coming in, not for that question. Looks like folks are very much in line with the phrasing as it stands. So moving on, we have, how should we think about the intersection of catastrophic and existential threats with technologies whose price performance is exponential? There was a clarification in the chat earlier that price performance is performance per price. I Googled it, and this is apparently often phrase that is associated in the tech space with telecom and information processing technologies. So, but obviously Geoff in his talk spoke more broadly to the role of technology vis-a-vis climate change. I wonder if we can if we need a rephrasing there. I see one that came up, can technological breakthroughs help address catastrophic and existential threats? Has one like at the moment. With 2 likes, we have, how should we think about the intersection of catastrophic and existential threats with technologies whose price performance is exponential? Clearly a very fraught and important topic, particularly as the tech world continues to become larger, perhaps in at least perceived as a more significant actor in the global political economy, and perhaps actually being one. Let's see, we have some rephrasings coming up. Just reading through these. We have that rephrased as, can technological breakthroughs help address catastrophic and existential threats? Excellent. So that now has, looks like 5 likes. Now turning back to a next question, the 4th question that was asked of the group, just pulling this up here. In what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible? Those listening intently will know that we went over this briefly along with the others at the beginning, but we haven't yet looked at how we might rephrase this one. So turning to that question now, in what ways I see we do have a rephrasing, or rather several likes, 4 of them, for the current phrasing of in what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible. Another phrasing suggested with 2 likes, which forms of democratic order are better suited to help build a sustainable future? And then another suggestion, which hasn't yet garnered likes, how can small-scale democratic institutions engage people in the places in which they live and affect change in political systems toward more hopeful and sustainable futures? If others care to redistribute likes at this point on this question, again, the question being, in what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible? That currently has 3 likes. So if others have rephrasings or want to change their likes on that question, please go ahead and do so. Otherwise, this will pass into, this phrasing will pass into the next step, making its way towards our final tally of the 100 questions. I would invite anyone who wishes to please raise your hand. I see, let's see. Oh, it looks like I have someone here. Jay, I know you raised your hand earlier. Dania, it sounds like you have an item for us. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Brennan. I do, and it's more of a comment, and so I'm not sure how helpful it's going to be, but I just wanted to acknowledge how difficult it is to really thoughtfully rephrase these questions. I mean, the question as it stands is extremely broad, and I wrote the original question, and that's definitely the way I intended it to be. So it really depends on kind of the goal for our constellation in the end, because I think the question as it stands can definitely inspire a whole array of follow-up research questions, but is obviously not sufficient. It can't be sufficiently answered. It needs to be narrowed down, and it can go in any of many directions, as Geoff spent some time discussing. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge how hard it is to specify it thoughtfully, and that's definitely something I want to be thinking about more, even after the session.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dania. You are absolutely right. And there is always a balance to make a research question that's really relevant. Obviously, there's, for a great many people across subfields, you're wanting to keep it sufficiently broad, but also narrow sufficiently so that the answers and research agendas it provokes truly add to the conversation, to the field, and to our shared understanding. So you're absolutely right there. This is a balancing act, and we are all in it together. I know I'm learning to do this better, and it sounds like you're feeling that you'll also carry that forward, and I'm sure others in the session are as well. I'm just looking through any new changes here. Again, if anyone wishes to, you're absolutely welcome to speak to the group if you see a concern or an item. But I don't see anyone there, and it looks like we also need to wrap up since we're coming to the close of this question editing. Please go ahead and read through, make sure that your likes are exactly where they need to be. And it looks like our questions, as we'll submit them, are, again, just to read through them. And please consider these as potential favorites. First, we have the questions from Geoff. What new tools of economic analysis might help us to address the potentially infinite costs of climate change? Must economics generalize? Beyond the data, can economics develop theories and or methods specific to time and place? Can the general equilibrium framework survive an era of permanent emergency? And consider as well the questions that you all have come up with and favorited in this session as potential contenders for your favorites. They are there historical examples of successful governance of global public goods? Could they inform us in our current challenges? In what ways can our current political systems be changed or adapted to create the conditions in which hope for a sustainable future is possible? What characteristics of the political economy of a society, for example, inequality, complexity, amplify the risks of climate change, considering both mitigation and adaptation? And finally, can technological breakthroughs help address catastrophic and existential threats? All of them critical questions. And please feel free to add your stars now and as we go forward. Very important that that the rest of the group get a sense of what each of you think are the most important questions, the best questions to create research that contributes fundamentally to the field, to, of course, scholarship generally, and to the species as a whole. So we're now going to turn back to the studio. I believe we have Jay in the studio who will be taking us to our next session. Thank you all so much. Again, my name is Brennan. It was a pleasure interacting with you, and look forward to continuing the discussion elsewhere.
Thank you, Brennan. Behind me, you see the galaxy in which you've just been working, and you can see floating. And I'm very sorry because I'm not Thomas. Thomas is usually the person who is the sort of weatherman of this tremendous galaxy, but just allow me to walk you through it. If I walk over here, you can see now the sustainability constellation. All the questions we've been discussing are highlighted. Geoff has submitted 4 questions to us that are featured, and we've also submitted a number of questions. Now let's dive right into the constellation, sustainability, to take a look at which are the most popular questions currently. If we take a look here, we have a list up here, starting with the top. The most favorited question currently in the constellation is, are economic growth and sustainability mutually exclusive? And that is, I think, one of the critical questions that speaks to a whole field called degrowth that is making a claim that we cannot continue to grow to make a sustainable planet. So I believe we are still trying to find that open question, whether or not growth can be done in a sustainable way. And I think that is a critical question for our society as a whole, our global society. If you take a look further down, we see with 3 favorites so far up there currently in the 100 favorite questions, including that because it is connected to the other questions. That is always an indicator it's currently ranked within the 100 most popular questions. It reads, how can we finance the green transition? And this is, of course, another critical question which we have not yet found an adequate answer for. And finance, of course, needs to answer both private sector or public investment, and how that is done and how that is done into an uncertain future. That is also what we talked about in the session, is something that we need to think about. Right below, we see another question that is currently being debated, and actually something we brought up into this conversation today, which reads, what characteristics of the political economy of society, inequality and complexity amplify the risks of climate change? That's a question we've just now added into the graph. So thank you for doing that. And you can see also Geoff's questions already have 2 favorites. They are now inside the constellation. So now let's go back into the whole galaxy, and we take a look again at the entirety of all the questions. Again, be reminded that the connections between the galaxies, between the various questions, indicate that these stars are currently inside the 100 most liked questions. So with that, let's take a look at the next session. We're going to be back very shortly with the next, actually it's almost like a panel, but we have Michael Sandel, who is going to come and actually potentially also talk about his new book, which he's currently published. And we are very honored to also have Rana Farahar, who will discuss the questions that Michael is bringing to our attention. So with that, I will see you very soon at the next discussion at the top of the hour.